Hello everybody. In this video I'm going to talk about the narration style of burial rites. Now the reason why I wanted to dedicate an entire video to this is because the narration style of burial rites is so unique and there's so much that you can talk about, but also because when we are analysing our writers' choices, analysing the decisions that Hannah Kent has made in terms of the narration style is really, really effective, but also something that's really simple for us to remember, and we can use it to discuss every single concept, every single character, pretty much anything that you are asked, you will be able to utilize something to do with the narration style. Now we know we could get a question that is just all about the narrative choices and the narration style of burial rites, but more than likely we'll get a question that will allow us to use this as perhaps one of our arguments or even just within our analysis somewhere. Now, in order for us to do this, we have to understand the way in which the narrative is constructed. So, Burial Rites is a novel that is written in first and third person perspective. Now, when we talk about that, we know we have to analyze the why. So anytime we talk about any of the aesthetic features or stylistic devices or anything ever, we have to make sure we're making authoritative interpretations. So we want to be able to say things like, Kent has chosen to write the narrative in both first and third person to allow readers to see varied perspectives on the conditions of 19th century Iceland. And then I would obviously go into it a little bit more than that, but we want to make sure that we are making those interpretations. Now, in the first person perspective of the novel, we get Agnes's perspective. So we get a first-hand look at the intense agony that she is facing, and we get to see the built-up angst that's there, but we also get a front row seat to her growth as a character and all of the times in which her perspective has shifted. If we look at the line, everybody's least favorite line in the novel, I must remember to ask Nathan, we only get that because Kent has given us a first-person perspective of Agnes's experiences. If I'm choosing to analyze the use of first-person perspective in the text, I want to make sure that I'm being really specific. So if I'm saying something like, due to Kent's use of first-person perspective, audiences are able to see the impact Nathan has on Agnes, I can't just leave it at that because I actually haven't said what the use of the perspective is. So I want to say something like, through Kent's use of a first-person perspective, readers are able to gain insight into how much Nathan impacts Agnes, as evidenced by one of her final thoughts being to ask Nathan, or I must remember to ask him. This shows readers that Nathan was on Agnes's mind right up until the end. So you can see there that I've given an example of this first-person perspective being used, but I am also making sure that I'm interpreting it in an authoritative manner. Now, when the novel is not in first person, it is in a third person omniscient perspective. So what that means is that it's third person, so we get a whole heap of different people's perspectives, but we are able to get an insight into multiple characters' minds. So when we talk about omniscient perspective, it means all-knowing. So the alternative would be a third-person limited perspective, which would mean we wouldn't get to be able to read our characters' minds. So because we know what's going on in Margaret's mind, because we know what's going on in Toadie's mind, we are able to understand the characters further, but we're also able to see a little bit more of a shift in terms of the reliability of the novel. Now we know that Agnes is an unreliable narrator because she is going through such turmoil and she is feeling all of the things, so her narration style is not always reliable. For example, on page 88, because this part of the chapter is written in a third-person perspective, we're able to gain insight into Toti's attitude about his meeting with Agnes and his initial perspective on the situation. So he thinks to himself, thoughts of Agnes sitting beside him sprang to his mind. His father knew that he wasn't visiting Agnes. He would be ashamed to know that his son could not shoulder the responsibility of one woman's atonement. But what to do with a woman who was not willing to atone? That provides us with quite a bit of insight into Toadie's initial perspective. If I'm wanting to discuss the growth in character of Toadie, because we know out of all the characters, he grows in one of the most significant ways, by saying that early on in the novel, he questions what to do with a woman who's not willing to atone, and towards the end, he is constantly saying, I am here, Agnes, and, you know, everything. There's so much we could say at the latter end of the novel. That shows the growth. But we wouldn't have that if we didn't have that third person perspective. We want to be sure that we're not just saying Kent uses narrative perspective to do something. We want to be really nice and specific. So through this use of a third person perspective, we could even say through a third person omniscient perspective. Third person would suffice, but you can go that bit further if you need. You want to be really specific so that your marker knows that you know what you're talking about, because you do. Now, within both our first person and our third person perspectives, we have a whole heap of other different narrative choices that Hannah Kent has made in order to construct her text. Those happens within the first person perspective, and that is stream of consciousness. So stream of consciousness is when an author writes in the same way that someone may think. So it's just that stream of consciousness. It's just exactly as the thoughts are going. And the best or perhaps strongest evidence of this happens just before Agnes is executed. And we all know that it stops making sense. And I know I'm not alone, that the first time I read the second, I believe it's the second last chapter of the novel, when it's in Agnes's perspective, I thought, this doesn't make sense. And I kept having to reread it, and I just couldn't understand it. And then I realized it was on purpose, because Kent has written in a stream of consciousness to really show us what Agnes is thinking, what she is feeling. When we are really stressed, or we are really nervous, or we are feeling really intense emotions, and I mean really intense emotions, we often lose our ability to think straight. That's what's happening here, okay? Because Agnes she knows that she is moments away from execution, and she is terrified, so she's unable to make sense. And Kent has been able to convey this to us through her use of stream of consciousness. So the example that I'm referring to, on page 323, it says, "The world has stopped snowing, stopped moving. The clouds hang still in the air like dead bodies." What a beautiful example of pathetic fallacy. "The only things that move are the ravens and the family of Cornsa, but I cannot tell which is which. They are all in black, jerking in circles around me, waiting to be fed." What a cool use of symbolism. This section is just dripping in all of the devices. "Where did time go? It left with summer. I am beyond time." That's my favorite quote in the novel. I am beyond time. Oh. Okay, I'm going to stop evaluating and I'm just going to keep reading. "Where is the Reverend, waiting by the river, looking for a skeleton amongst the moss, amongst the lava, amongst the ashes? Margaret is reaching out to me, and she takes my hand in hers, clasps my fingers so tightly that it hurts. It hurts. 'You are not a monster,' she says. Her face is flushed and she bites her lip. Her face is flushed and she bites her lip. She bites down. Her fingers, entwined with my own, are hot and greasy. 'They're going to kill me.' Who said that? Did I say that? 'We'll remember you, Agnes.' She presses my fingers more tightly until I almost cry from pain, and then I am crying. I don't want to be remembered. I want to be here. 'Margaret.' 'I am right here, Agnes. You'll be all right, my girl. My girl.' I am crying and my mouth is open and filled with something. It is choking me and I spit it out. On the ground is a stone, and I look back at Margaret and see she did not notice. The stone was in my mouth, I say, and her face creases because she does not understand. There is no time to explain. She has passed my hands on to Stainer, as though I am a token or a piece of bread, and they are all taking communion of me, and Stainer's fingers are cold. She lets go of my hand and wraps her arms around my neck. The sound of her sobbing is loud in my ear, but I cling to her because her body is warm, and I cannot remember when someone last held me like this, when someone last cared enough to lay their cheek next to mine. 'I'm so sorry,' I hear myself say. 'I am so sorry,' but I don't know what I am sorry for. Everyone is speaking in bubbles of air, and it is taking everything not to cry. My spine is cramped from not crying, but I am. The tears are here on my face. I don't know. Perhaps they are Stainer's. Everything is wet. It is the ocean. Will they drown me? I ask, and someone shakes her head. It is Loiga. 'Agnes,' she says, and I say, 'That is the first time you have called me by my name.' And that is it. She collapses as though I have stabbed her in the stomach. 'I think we should go,' Toadie is saying, and I want to turn to him, but I can't because we are all underwater and I cannot swim. Here, A hand takes my arm and I am lifted into the air. The sky comes closer, and for a moment I am going to collide with the clouds. But then I see they have put me on a horse, and like a corpse they are going to take me to the grave. Like a dead woman, they will bury me in the earth, pocket me like a stone. There are ravens in the sky, but what bird flies underwater? What bird can sing without stones beneath him to listen? Natan would know. I must remember to ask him. So obviously we're not going to remember that whole section. We don't need to memorize pages and pages of text, but I decided to read the whole thing because it's one of the best parts in the novel. But we can see that it stops. It doesn't make sense. It's just her thoughts one after the other after the other. There's no link between them because it is a stream of consciousness. And Kent purposefully does that because it allows us as readers to really understand the emotional toll that this is taking on Agnes. And this is her psychological demise. She is really struggling to come to terms with her fate here, which is ironic in nature, or perhaps a surprise to us at times, because earlier in the novel it seems that that is all she wanted, but now she doesn't want to be remembered, she wants to be here. Two other words that we often use to describe the narrative style of Burial Rites are fragmented and non-linear. We describe the novel as non-linear because it doesn't necessarily go in chronological order. Kent has included flashbacks particularly to allow us to see this non-linear construction. This allows us as readers to get a really nice insight into the multiple times of Agnes's life and the way in which they all are still impacting her today. So for example, when we have that flashback that is told to us through dialogue because we know that Agnes is saying it out loud, but for us it's a flashback to the night in which Inga died during childbirth. That's an example of a non-linear narrative because the novel starts with her being held at Storyborg. It ends with her being executed, but in between we get all these different times in her life. Similarly, the narrative style is fragmented. It jumps back and forth, particularly at the end when we do have that time in which Agnes is losing her ability to think straight, but also because of these flashbacks, we have this fragmented narrative style that shows us the fragmented nature of Agnes's life. It's choppy, it's up and down, it's haphazard, and so is the narrative on purpose. Something else that Kent does that's really unique and really important in her narrative is she has included historical documents. Now, at the beginning of every single chapter, there is an inclusion of a document, most of the time it's a historical one, that allows us to gain a greater insight into Agnes's story, but also it adds a layer of authenticity. We know that Kent's story is based on that of a true story, and by having these historical documents, it adds authenticity to the emotions and to the relationships and to the concepts, and all of the things are also intensified, right? So one of my favorites and one of the ones that we talk about the most is the historical document that gives us the list of Agnes's possessions. So by including that and by us being explicitly told that she has 8 buttons, if they can count the amount of buttons she owns on her list of possessions, then we know that she is incredibly poor, and that solidifies her status as a pauper that we have been told. Another historical document that is so important are all of those letters that are from Bjondel. And oftentimes I have students complain that they're quite boring, and they are on purpose, right? We have these dry letters from Bjondel in which he is talking in such a rigid and almost robotic way. That's such a stark contrast to the way he talks when he's speaking out loud. So we have Kent using dialogue, and we have Kent using these historical documents to juxtapose her construction of Bjondel as shifting who he is depending on his audience. But the historical documents allow us to see that it is Bjondel's decision, right? We know that there's the historical document where Bjondel says, "in my opinion," and then talks about the fact that Agnes is guilty. But we also have the authoritative tone to his letters and the way in which he speaks that further cements him as this position of power that is unrelenting. And the historical documents aren't the only way that we know that, but they add to it and they add depth to that. So for example, on page 160, we have a letter from Bjondel to Toti, and a part of it says, Once you similarly give me an account of what has and continues to transpire between you and the criminal, I might comprehend to what degree religious instruction is collectively bettering the condemned. So that's what Bjondel says in his letter to Toti. But then when him and Toti meet later in that chapter, have Bjondel saying to Toti, the gentle tones of a friend, I hope I am mistaken in thinking you are serious. This condescending tone that is still powerful. We know that the letter is powerful, but it's quite bleak. Whereas here we have a little bit more arrogance coming through, which is quite a contrast to what we saw earlier. Chapter 8 starts with a poem from poet Rosa to Nathan, and the translation of it ends with, traitor, look at your misfortune. These are my thoughts, they're true. Oh, how this rose of Katascard has gone and poisoned you. Now that rose is Agnes, and we find that out a little bit later. But by us having this poem where Rosa says that Agnes has poisoned Nathan, we have some really strong evidence of the opinion of Agnes throughout society. But this is different, and this is in a different form. So by including this historical document of a poem, we are able to see a stronger example of that. There are so many different narration choices, or even just choices that Kent makes through her construction of burial rites that we could discuss, but these are a really good start, and the collection of devices we've spoken about today, we can absolutely use in our essay. Just remember that you have to give an example or be specific, and you have to make sure you're making an authoritative interpretation, which you absolutely can do. Have a go at using some of these in one of your practice essays, send it to me, I'll give you some feedback, and then you'll go and smash the exam. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you soon. Bye.